Welcome to Ryan Epic Explains, where power, strategy, and history are examined without illusion. The American Civil War ended in April 1865 with the most decisive military outcome imaginable. The Confederacy was destroyed, its armies surrendered, its government dissolved, its economy shattered, and its central institution, chattel slavery, was abolished by constitutional amendment. The Union possessed more than 1,000,000 men under arms, the most powerful military apparatus on the planet, and an industrial economy accelerating toward global dominance. By every conventional measure of strategic victory, the North had won totally. And yet, within 12 years, the political aims of that victory had been almost entirely reversed. By 1877, the former Confederate states had restored white supremacist governments. Black citizens who had briefly voted, held office, and owned property were systematically stripped of those gains. The federal government, which had just fought the bloodiest war in American history to preserve the Union and end slavery, voluntarily withdrew its forces from the South and abandoned the people it had liberated. The nation that had demonstrated extraordinary willingness to spend 620,000 to 750,000 lives over 4 years decided, in peace, that it could not sustain the political cost of enforcing what it had won in war. This raises the central interpretive question of the entire Reconstruction era. Why did the most powerful government in the Western Hemisphere, at the peak of its military and moral authority, fail to secure the peace it had paid so dearly to achieve? The answer is not a story of incompetence or sudden moral collapse. It is a story of competing priorities, structural constraints, economic disruption, and the cold arithmetic of political sustainability. The North did not forget what the war was about. It decided, incrementally and rationally, that the costs of continued enforcement exceeded what its political system was willing to bear. What followed was not an accident. It was a calculation. To understand the strategic landscape of post-war America, one must begin with the condition of the South in the spring of 1865. The former Confederacy was an occupied territory in all but name. Its infrastructure was devastated. Railroad networks were wrecked across Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas. The plantation economy, built entirely on enslaved labor, no longer functioned. Approximately 4 million formerly enslaved people were free but possessed no land, no capital, no legal standing, and no institutional support. Confederate currency was worthless. 1/4 of Southern white men of military age were dead. Into this vacuum stepped the federal government, with no coherent plan. Abraham Lincoln had sketched the outlines of a lenient Reconstruction. His 10% plan of 1863 would have readmitted Southern states once 10% of their 1860 voters swore loyalty and accepted emancipation. It was deliberately generous, designed to shorten the war by offering a path back. But Lincoln was assassinated on April 14, 1865, 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Whatever flexibility his political genius might have brought to post-war policy died with him at Ford's Theater. What leaders understood at the time was that Lincoln's removal created a power vacuum, not just in the presidency, but in the strategic direction of Reconstruction itself. His successor, Andrew Johnson, was a war Democrat from Tennessee. A Unionist, certainly, but also a white supremacist who had no interest in black advancement. Johnson moved immediately to restore the Southern states with minimal conditions. He issued amnesty to nearly all former Confederates, allowed Southern legislatures to reconstitute themselves, and vetoed every major piece of civil rights legislation Congress sent to his desk. He vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau extension. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. He vetoed all 3 military Reconstruction Acts. Congress overrode every one of those vetoes, but Johnson's obstruction consumed enormous political capital and critical time. The result was a 2-year window, from mid-1865 through early 1867, in which the South was allowed to begin reconstructing itself largely on its own terms. Southern legislatures wasted no time. Mississippi and South Carolina passed the first black codes in late 1865, laws designed to replicate the conditions of slavery through vagrancy statutes, labor contract requirements, and restrictions on black land ownership and movement. The message was explicit. military defeat had not altered the Southern power structure's fundamental intentions. By 1867, congressional Republicans recognized that presidential Reconstruction had failed. The Radical Republicans, led by Thaddeus Stevens in the House and Charles Sumner in the Senate, seized control of policy. The first Reconstruction Act of March 1867 divided the South into 5 military districts under the command of Union generals. Former Confederate states were required to draft new constitutions guaranteeing black male suffrage and to ratify the 14th Amendment before readmission to the Union. Federal troops would enforce compliance. This was the most aggressive assertion of federal power over state governance in American history. It was also, in strategic terms, extraordinarily ambitious. Stevens understood that legal equality without economic independence was insufficient. On February 5, 1866, he had proposed an amendment to the Freedmen's Bureau Bill authorizing the distribution of confiscated Confederate land to freedmen in 40-acre parcels. The proposal failed. It was, in hindsight, the single most consequential defeat of Reconstruction. Without land redistribution, 4 million freed people remained economically dependent on the same planter class that had enslaved them. What congressional leaders understood was that they were operating within severe constraints. The Republican coalition included moderates who supported civil rights in principle but resisted anything resembling confiscation of private property. Northern voters were willing to support black suffrage as an abstract constitutional principle, but were far less willing to support the sustained military occupation and federal expenditure required to enforce it on the ground. The political arithmetic was fragile from the beginning, yet the initial results were remarkable. Between 1867 and 1870, approximately 700,000 black men registered to vote across the South. Black candidates won seats in state legislatures, in governorships, and in the United States Congress. Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first black U.S. Senator in 1870. Over the course of Reconstruction, more than 1,500 black Americans held elected office, including 16 members of Congress. The Freedmen's Bureau, despite chronic underfunding and only 900 agents to cover the entire South, established over 4,000 schools, built 40 hospitals, and distributed 21 million rations to displaced people of both races. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, ratified in July 1868, established birthright citizenship and equal protection under law. The 15th Amendment, ratified in February 1870, prohibited the denial of voting rights based on race. Together, these 3 amendments constituted the most radical expansion of constitutional rights in American history. They were the structural achievement of Reconstruction, and they would outlast everything else. But the forces of counter-revolution were organizing simultaneously. The Ku Klux Klan, founded in Pulaski, Tennessee in December 1865, evolved from a fraternal club into a paramilitary terrorist network within 2 years. By 1868, Klan violence had become systematic. Night riders targeted black voters, Republican office holders, white unionists, and school teachers across the South. The objective was precise: to destroy black political participation through fear. The methods included murder, arson, whipping, and the destruction of property. The scale of this violence is difficult to overstate. The Colfax Massacre of April 13, 1873, in Grant Parish, Louisiana, saw a white militia slaughter between 60 and 150 black men, many of them after they had surrendered. Historian Eric Foner has described it as the worst single incident of racial violence during Reconstruction. It was not an isolated event. Across Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Alabama, organized white supremacist groups, the KKK, the White League, the Red Shirts, waged a sustained campaign of political terrorism. President Ulysses Grant responded with the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, the latter commonly known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. These laws authorized the federal government to prosecute individuals who conspired to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights. Grant declared martial law in 9 counties of South Carolina in October 1871. Federal troops arrested hundreds of Klansmen. Prosecutions temporarily broke the Klan's organizational structure in several states. Yet the underlying constraint remained. Federal enforcement required troops, courts, marshals, and sustained political will. Grant had approximately 6,000 soldiers deployed across the entire South, a ratio that made sustained suppression of decentralized insurgency impossible without massive escalation. Congress was not willing to fund that escalation. Northern voters, increasingly focused on economic concerns, were not willing to support it. The cost-benefit calculation was shifting. The event that accelerated that shift more than any other was the Panic of 1873. In September of that year, the banking house of J. Cook and Company collapsed, triggering the first global depression of the industrial age. Within 2 years, 89 of the nation's 364 railroads had gone bankrupt. 18,000 businesses failed. Unemployment surged to levels not seen before in American history. By 1876, an estimated 14% of the workforce was unemployed. The economic crisis transformed the political landscape. Northern voters who had supported Reconstruction now demanded that their government address unemployment, currency policy, and railroad regulation. The Republican Party fractured between hard-money conservatives and inflationist populists. Reconstruction, which required continuous federal expenditure and military commitment, became politically untenable. The 1874 midterm elections produced a Democratic landslide in the House of Representatives, the first Democratic majority since before the Civil War. The party that had led the Confederacy was now positioned to shape national legislation. While this appeared decisive on its own terms, the deeper structural reality was that Northern capital was already reorienting. The great economic engine of post-war America was not the Southern cotton economy, but westward railroad expansion, industrial manufacturing, and financial consolidation. The South, economically devastated and resistant to modernization, represented a diminishing share of national strategic interest. The incentive to invest political capital in Southern Reconstruction declined in direct proportion to the rise of competing economic priorities. By the mid-1870s, the pattern was clear. In state after state, white supremacist Redeemer governments were reclaiming power through a combination of voter intimidation, ballot fraud, and organized violence. Mississippi's 1875 election was effectively decided by the White League and Red Shirts, whose systematic terrorism suppressed black voter turnout so thoroughly that Republicans lost the state legislature. Grant considered deploying federal troops, but was advised by Attorney General Edwards Pierpont that further intervention in Mississippi would cost Republicans in upcoming northern elections. Grant relented. Mississippi was redeemed. What mattered was not the event itself, but what it revealed about the federal government's evolving strategic posture. The decision not to intervene in Mississippi was not made on moral grounds. It was made on political arithmetic. The Republican Party calculated that defending black voters in Mississippi was less valuable than retaining white voters in Ohio and Pennsylvania. Reconstruction was being weighed not against its stated principles, but against its electoral costs. The 1876 presidential election brought the contradiction to its final crisis. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden produced disputed results in 3 southern states: South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, the last states where federal troops still maintained a Reconstruction presence. The election was deadlocked. Both parties claimed victory. The country faced a genuine constitutional crisis. The resolution came through negotiation, not principle. In what historians call the Compromise of 1877, Republican and Democratic leaders reached an informal agreement. Hayes would receive the disputed electoral votes and the presidency. In exchange, federal troops would be withdrawn from the South, effectively ending federal enforcement of Reconstruction. The deal was consummated. Hayes was inaugurated on March 4, 1877. The soldiers left. The consequences unfolded with structural inevitability. Without federal enforcement, Southern states systematically dismantled the political infrastructure that Reconstruction had built. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and white-only primaries eliminated black voter participation with devastating efficiency. In Louisiana, where 130,000 black voters had been registered in 1896, only 1,342 remained on the rolls by 1904. In Mississippi, black voter registration dropped from over 90% during Reconstruction to virtually zero by 1900. The legal architecture of segregation was formalized. Southern states passed hundreds of Jim Crow laws mandating racial separation in schools, transportation, hospitals, cemeteries, and public accommodations. In 1896, the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson upheld Louisiana's Separate Car Act, establishing the doctrine of separate but equal, and providing constitutional legitimacy to the entire Jim Crow system. The 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection was, for practical purposes, rendered inoperative for the next 6 decades. The economic dimension was equally devastating. Without the land redistribution that Thaddeus Stevens had championed, the overwhelming majority of black Southerners were absorbed into the sharecropping system, a structure that generated cycles of debt and dependency functionally resembling the bondage it replaced. White landowners controlled the land, the credit, and the local courts. High interest rates on goods purchased on credit ensured that most sharecroppers ended each year deeper in debt than they began. It was economic subordination, maintained through legal and extra-legal coercion, and it would persist in recognizable form well into the 20th century. The question, then, resolves itself not through any single betrayal, but through an accumulation of structural pressures. The North possessed the power to enforce Reconstruction indefinitely. It chose not to because the political, economic, and institutional costs of sustained occupation exceeded what its democratic system would sustain. The Panic of 1873 redirected public attention. The rise of industrial capitalism redirected capital. The exhaustion of wartime idealism redirected political energy. And the decentralized, persistent nature of Southern white supremacist resistance raised the cost of enforcement beyond what any administration was willing to pay, without a corresponding domestic constituency demanding it. This was not weakness in the conventional sense. It was the logic of democratic politics applied to a problem that required something more durable than democratic politics could provide. Reconstruction needed generational commitment. 30 years, perhaps 50, of federal enforcement, economic investment, and institutional development. What it received was 12 years of partial effort, declining resources, and eroding political will. The constitutional amendments survived. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments remained embedded in the nation's foundational law, dormant but alive, waiting for a future generation to revive their enforcement. When the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s finally dismantled legal segregation, it did so by invoking the very amendments that Reconstruction had produced. Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 overturned Plessy. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 fulfilled, nearly a century later, the promises that the Reconstruction Congress had written into law. The aftermath of the American Civil War teaches a lesson that extends far beyond the boundaries of any single nation's history. Military victory, no matter how complete, does not automatically produce political transformation. The distance between winning a war and securing its objectives is measured not in battles, but in sustained institutional commitment. Power, even overwhelming power, is finite when distributed across competing priorities, and the political will to enforce revolutionary change is always more fragile than the change itself requires. The men who designed Reconstruction understood this. Thaddeus Stevens, dying in August 1868, knew that without land redistribution, legal equality would remain theoretical. Frederick Douglass warned repeatedly that the North's commitment was shallow and conditional. They were not naive. They simply lacked the political resources to overcome the structural constraints of a democratic system that had already spent its reserves of wartime solidarity. History closed the question of Reconstruction not with a declaration, but with a withdrawal. The troops marched out of their southern garrisons. The telegraph lines carried no announcement. The freedmen watched them go and understood, with a clarity that required no explanation, what it meant. The nation had decided what kind of peace it was willing to pay for. The cost of a more just peace was higher than the Republic would bear. That calculation, made in committee rooms and railway offices and backroom negotiations in the winter of 1877, would define American life for the next century. Restraint, in this case, was not wisdom. It was the sound of a country choosing reconciliation over justice, stability over equity, and the comfort of the majority over the rights of the vulnerable. The amendments endured, the promise did not. And the distance between the two became the central unresolved tension of American democracy, a tension that remains, in many ways,